All right, so we got all our frames fitting up beautifully. Everything came together really nicely. I didn't have to use our little trick anywhere on here yet. I'm sure it'll come up later on once I actually get onto the finishing stage of this. But everything is coming together. It's all nice and solid, even with no glue in there. Everything holds together perfectly well. And so the last thing we need to do while we have the dado stack installed in the table saw is just cut grooves all the way down these inside pieces. And so the plan here is to make it so that the base of the trunk is removable. So all I'm going to be putting, the reason I'm putting a groove in here is because we're going to install some bottom supports that are going to just hold the base up and something we can put a couple of screws through to really fasten the base down. Now, it's really important when you're building a trunk like this to make sure that the base is removable. And so it's very likely that something heavy is going to get dropped on the bottom panel of this trunk. So what's a really bad idea is if you have a fixed panel in the bottom, we glue it into the grooves that we're cutting in here. Then if that panel ever gets busted, your trunk is just kind of useless. It's very hard to go and repair that. Whereas if the bottom panel is removable, you can just go in and build a new bottom panel for it and replace it, in a couple days. Alright, so I always forget how labor intensive doing panels this way is, but we are getting good progress. So if you guys haven't figured out yet, this cherry that I've got in the pile here is what's going to be making up all of our little floating panels in the carcass of this trunk here. And so I've shown this technique before of cutting strips off of 8/4 stock and then gluing them up together in a flat panel to then get, kind of fake quarter sawn stock. But what we're left with in our pile of pieces here is 3 different looks. So some of our pieces are like this one where we just have good, clean, straight grain, nothing really spectacular about it, but it's also exactly what I want. It's what I'm mostly looking for here. We also have pieces like this that is fully quarter sawn, so you get a little bit of ray flex. Cherry has very small ray flex, but when you get into this quarter sawn stuff, you get a lot of them, so it's a very interesting look too. And then the other piece of cherry, or other type of cherry that we have here, let me see if I can find one in here. Looks like, like this one, which has a lot of figure or blotchiness to it. Just depends how you think about it. A lot of people call it blotchiness in cherry, but I just think of it as a little bit of curl or figure because you just get a lot of little interesting details where the light changes as it hits through the piece of wood. And so between these 3 different types of wood, again, you can kind of see if I put them together there's a little bit of a difference to them. These 2 on the outside here, the straight grain one and the one that has a little bit of blotchiness to it, are very similar in looks. They both have good, clean, straight grain to them. One of them is just a little bit more more blotchy. And so when we're putting these panels together, what we want to make sure of is that we're not mixing and matching these. Mostly, the straight grain and the little bit of blotchiness one, those two can be mixed together, not really any issue. You're not really going to notice a big difference between them. As long as you line up the grain, they look just as good together as they do apart. There's not really any big difference. But what you don't want to do is mix a really clean straight grain quarter sawn one that with a little ray flex in it with any of the other two. So here's one where we have good clean straight grain, which this would be classified as rift sawn, fully rift sawn, and here we have one that's fully quarter sawn. And so putting them together, there's a massive difference in the looks of the piece of wood. This one just has clean straight grain to it, whereas this one has all the little ray flecks going through it. So what we don't want to do is on mix and match those two. That's the most important thing. So now I'm going to start the hardest part of this, is going through these 60 individual pieces and trying to make 8 panels out of that. So I'm just going to go through, mix and match the pieces together, and when I get a good panel that I think works well together, then I'm just going to mark it as one single panel and set it aside. And I'm just going to keep going through the process here until we get 8 really good looking panels. Alright, so this thing is definitely starting to come together now. We've got the whole structure together. We've got all of our cherry panels in here now. Everything looks really, really good. I'm super excited with how this thing is coming out, and I'm really excited to keep going with it because I think it's just going to keep getting better and better and better. So really the trick here is that the fact that I'm working with walnut is what I find so exciting. And so the last thing we need to do before we actually get into the finishing stage is we need to add our curved profiles. So along all of our bottom stretches here, we're going to be taking them up about 1 inch off the bottom. So it's going to start flush the corner here and then go up about 1 inch off the center here. And so what that'll do is it'll make it look like this thing is 2 inches off the ground, when in reality it's only 1 inch in most places. So it's just a way of making this thing seem a little bit lighter and a little bit more airy and creating a little bit more of a space into there, because this 1 inch gap down that's here now is not a whole lot of space under a piece of furniture. You want to make sure there's more space so the piece seems a little bit bigger. If it's too close to the ground, it's going to make it seem smaller. Alright, so now we're going to move on to cutting the rounded detail on the bottom pieces. So we've got a couple different sizes that we're going to be dealing with here. We've got our short side pieces and we've got our long front and back pieces. And so how we're going to do this is we're just going to start by laying out our lines, and we're going to be using a drawing bow to get a nice even curve. And so all it is just a 3/16 piece of white oak that has fairly straight grain to it, so it doesn't bend and warp on me too much. And it's just got a piece of paracord strung between them with this little piece that's notched between that. And so the way that this works is as I tighten this string, the long piece of white oak gets a curve to it. So you can see just like that, it gets a nice even curve all the way through it. Now what you can do with these things is get a nice even curve, but you can also get asymmetrical curves. So just depending on where you have your end holes drilled in, now I have these holes drilled at equal distance from both ends, so that's what gives me a symmetrical curve. But if you bring this one in more so to the middle, or closer to the middle section, you can get an asymmetrical curve. So if you don't want to make one of these yourselves, you want one that's a little bit more accurate, you can go to Lee Valley. They make, I think it's made of plastic and it has a plastic strap on the back. So it would be a little bit more accurate just because, again, wood has a tendency to move and be a little bit more inaccurate. But this has always worked for me and gives me a nice even curve. Even if it's not a precision curve, it still works just fine. And so before we can use the drawing bow, what we need to go through and do is mark out all of our alignment lines. So we know that we want to be 1 inch up from both of the bottom edges on both of these pieces. We also want to be about 1/2 inch in, that's where we want to start the curve. And so because this doesn't have to be absolutely precise, we're just going to use a combination square and a pencil to mark out our lines. Now what we do want to know is pretty much precisely where the middle of this is. And so because I know that my piece is about 38.5 inches, that means I'm going to want to go 19.25 inches and mark that as my center. Then from there, using my combo square, I can mark 1 inch up and just make sure that I bring that line all the way up so I know exactly where I'm aligning it to. And so on my drawing bow, I have the center line of this piece of wood marked. So this is about a 42.5 inch piece. So then I have it marked at 21.25. And so all I want to do is basically just line up that right on our middle point of this board. And I'm just going to tighten the string until this piece perfectly matches and hits our other 2 marks. And then the last thing, you just go through with the pencil and mark from point to point. Again, you don't want to push too hard because you can very easily push your drawing bow out of alignment. So it does help to have a nice sharp pencil. But now we have a nice symmetrical curve going all the way across. And so on our smaller side pieces, you kind of have 2 different options. So what we're going to do on these is we're going to bring them up the same inch that we brought up our front and back pieces. That way we have a consistent height overall. But the other option is you can have a consistent curve. Now this is less popular because obviously it's going to look a little bit weird having your side pieces a little bit lower down, but it is another option. So you'd keep your drawing bow the same, mark all your same lines, line it up, and draw a curve. Now what this is going to do is it's just going to have a much lower curve to this piece. So it's going to be the exact same curve profile as your front and back, but it'll just be less. Now in my opinion, this doesn't look very good because it makes everything look just weird. Your sides are going to look a lot lower down than your front and back, and it just doesn't look good overall. And so on these pieces instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to go in, mark all of our same marks at 1 inch up in the center, and then 1.25 inches in from our the outside of our tendons. And so with all these marked out, we can then go over to the bandsaw, and I can leave my normal 5/8 inch bandsaw blade on there because we're doing a wide enough curve. We can use a nice wide blade. We don't have to change it out to anything smaller. But if you're doing anything where it's a small curve, you're going to want to go down to a much smaller blade. Most of the time when you're doing this stuff, you do like a 1/4 inch blade because that'll give you the most ability to go around a curve. But again, this is a nice wide sweeping curve across this whole thing. I'm not afraid of going at it with the 5/8 blade because we've got plenty of turning radius to get through both of these size pieces. Alright, so I finished cutting all the curves into our pieces here, and I didn't show a lot of footage of it because it kind of went south really quickly. Sadly enough, the only one that really went poorly was our front stretcher, which is probably the worst thing to have happen. But what I ended up doing is when I was cutting it on the bandsaw, I didn't have my lines dark enough, and I just either went way off or missed it completely. But yeah, I ended up making far too sharp an angle upwards and not really a smooth curve. So I've gone through and I've adjusted them so they all match up nicely. We've got two very consistent curves, and then I used a flush trim bit on my router table to get everything nicely matching. So they all look really good. Even though it's not what I wanted initially, I still think it looks just fine. The only minor problem I had is on the router table, I did get a little bit of breakout or tear out right on the end here where the bit, obviously, I just took a little bit too big of a bite on it with the flush trim bit. It just broke out the grains, but that only happened on the back stretcher, so again, not too concerned about it. It's something that'll be easy to either sand out and fix or just not really worry about because it's on the backside anyway.